a great pleasure to welcome our own Doug McNeill to talk about surviving social media. So Doug is a very seasoned tweeter, and I hope he will encourage you all to participate, to get involved with social media, and possibly to be involved with our own science Twitter feed at Met Office, or to tweet from your own accounts. So thanks very much, Doug, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end.
Okay, thanks very much. Otherwise known as Why is Doug on Twitter Again? I just wanted to offer a really personal perspective, I guess, about what I've been up to for the last sort of 7 or 8 years, how I found it beneficial being on Twitter, and how I think that it's beneficial for any scientist to be on Twitter, how it's particularly beneficial for an institution like the Met Office and the Hadley Centre to sort of be represented on social media in general, and what we might get from that, but also well, the title of the talk, Surviving Climate Social Media, also some of the dangers that you might come across, or some of the downsides, and perhaps what I've learned about how to look out for those and how to mitigate those. So who would know that a 15th century painter would accurately predict the state of social media and climate messaging at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century? But there it is. This is how I feel sometimes when I log on. I'm sure that's how some people feel when they log on. Who here, actually, I should start with a question. Who here is on Twitter already? Who's got a Twitter account? Active Twitter users. That's pretty high, right? Okay, who here is on Facebook? Active Facebook users. Okay, you guys are really unusual in that there's almost as many Twitter users as anything else. Who's on Reddit? Is somebody active on Reddit? Instagram. Anybody on Instagram? Few. Okay. Okay, so the climate conversation really got started on social media with blogs back in the sort of early 2000s, mid-2000s and late 2000s, as people started to get organized. And really the climate conversation was dominated, was pretty niche, but went widespread with climate skeptic blogs like What's Up With That, which got followed up with sort of the anti-What's Up With That, which was Real Climate, which is a group of climate scientists. And then the climate skeptics started to get organized in other countries, and they started coming up with policy foundations a bit later on. Climate, etc., is also a sort of pretty skeptic website. But with Twitter in the early 2010s, suddenly the public could talk about climate in a way that they hadn't before. So we saw a lot of climate scientists piling onto Twitter. And then towards the mid part of the 2010s, it became pretty apparent that Facebook was going to dominate. Everybody practically has a Facebook account. Almost everybody here has got a Facebook account. More recently, perhaps since the 2016 election, 2017, we started to see concerns about privacy with Facebook. We've started to see scandals coming out about Facebook, people being concerned about using it. And so other forms of social media have started to become more popular. So you see Reddit, Snapchat, and Instagram, basically all the cool kids. All the cool kids are on those social media. It's, Twitter's for granddads like me now. So recently, Reddit was very proud because they passed the same number of active users as Twitter. So Reddit is becoming it's a sort of longer form of Twitter, I guess, where you can upvote comments, which means that they become more visible. But the bad news is the news is even with all the scandals, Facebook's everything, right? This becomes even larger. So the bars represent the number of active users in millions. So there's sort of 2.5 billion people up there on the right with Facebook. Twitter's and Reddit are down here with sort of 330 million each platform active users monthly. So pretty much everybody's on Facebook, sort of a good fraction of the world. If you look at dwell time, the amount of people actually spend on each social media sort of version, Facebook completely dominates. Everything else would be right down here, and Facebook would be over there out the door. So this is interesting because, in this environment, people aren't using Facebook so much for climate communication. I think they're using Twitter. There's interesting sort of reasons for that. Okay, so the landscape. This was a great, the Carbon Brief, which is a climate communication sort of think tank based in the UK, hired a statistician to map the conversation on Twitter during 2016. So the US elections were going on. Climate change was a big part of the global conversation, perhaps not as big as we'd hoped, but it was a big part of the election conversation. A lot of things happened in 2016. Brexit happened in 2016, and this is a graphical representation of the links between people. So each one of these tiny dots is a person, and the arcs between them are a sort of tweet or a conversation that's happening between those people, right? So the darker the lines are, the harder the more communication there is between those accounts, okay? And they broadly group out into, do I have a zapper here? Yes, I do. They sort of form these regions, these sort of sub-collections within this map. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to see who they are, individual users. But here you have a lot of people in the main scientific and political consensus, but over here you've got a lot of the climate skeptics talking to each other, and only to each other most of the time. You've got national sort of bubbles as well here. Sort of Canada talks to itself, and you would expect the UK to talk to itself as well, and Australia. The Anglosphere is the English-speaking world is particularly skeptic, actually. A lot of the English-speaking world is particularly skeptic towards climate change science, interestingly so. And so you see that coming out in these bubbles. They had some really interesting findings in that as well. I went and found myself. Obviously, that's what you do when this kind of thing comes up. You sort of zoom into the map, and zoom in, so all the way. And then I found Rich Betts, who's my boss. I was like, okay, so I must be here somewhere. And zoom. I couldn't find myself basically on that map. You can zoom in as far as you want. I'm sort of out in the outer reaches of the galactic arm of these bubbles. But interestingly, the person who's right in the middle is Leo DiCaprio for some reason. Seriously, he's like the hub. During the US elections, he was he's a climate change or climate policy advocate, and he was the center of the global conversation about climate change on Twitter in 2016. So, okay, celebrity clearly important. He's a strong advocate. He's a household name. It's pretty important. The scientists are nowhere. I haven't got many followers, but even people with lots of followers, 20,000, 30,000 followers, are nowhere on this map compared to Leo. So I think that's worth bearing in mind when we think about influencing the global conversation. Yes, up to a point. UK climate skepticism. I mentioned some of these policy forums that have started up, and they can get quite a lot of airtime. And it can seem like there's a big global conspiracy of climate skeptics that are out to get climate scientists. And I think to a certain extent that's true, and it's kind of funded. But my mental picture of a lot of the climate skeptics that I engage with online is this guy here who's in his shed. Sort of people who used to play with model train sets. I love playing with model train sets, they're brilliant. But I think people have moved away from model train sets upon retirement and into hassling climate scientists online, basically. I really genuinely think that it's a bit of a hobby for a lot of people, and that perhaps you should bear that in mind if you're getting hassle from some skeptic online. Right? It's quite possible they're just in their shed, and really they should be playing with the train set. So. Oh, sorry. Thank you. This doesn't have a clip. Did you? I heard this morning. Okay, I'll do this too. This is good. If it's good enough for Albert. Okay. So why do we need social media anyway? Or why would you even be online? So I did the standard thing that anybody who's on Twitter who's got a talk to write does. I asked Twitter, hey everybody, tomorrow I'm going to try and convince a bunch of my climate scientist colleagues that they should be on Twitter. What should I tell them? And this was this morning. I got a number of responses, some of which were more useful than others. Tell them you get 280 characters now. Thanks, John. Is John in? No, he's not. Okay, I see Gareth here. Okay, that's good. I got some responses from Gareth as well. Thanks, John. That's useful. But it's true. Okay, Twitter's expanded its character limit. But tell them it's the 21st century. This is Fair enough. This is Catherine Hayhoe, a professor of meteorology in the US, and she's great at bringing communities together, sort of politically diverse communities together. She says, honestly, the number one reason I'm on Twitter is for personal gain. There's such a vibrant scientific community here that I get the majority of my science news from. I even find out when my own papers have been published from Twitter. That comes up quite often when somebody posts before the journal even emails me. Right? So I think, for myself, the primary reason that I use social media is for personal gain, essentially. I think it's great. I think I'm sort of more widely known outside of this building than I would be due to my citation record by miles. It flattens hierarchies, right? So I can tweet the head of NASA GIS anytime and, make a joke. And that wouldn't have been available to a sort of early to mid-career researcher at any time in history, as far as I'm aware. I think it's fast. It means that you can respond to things really quickly. What else? There's a whole bunch of other personal reasons that are kind of for personal gain. Gareth here points out that it's led to him being a co-author on at least 2 papers. The same has happened to me, and I've been invited to give lots of talks just because of nattering about on Twitter. I think even last month that happened to me. This is really important. So this is Rich. This is my boss. You'll recognize him. He's a Hadley Center person too. It lets you cut out the middleman, the media, and control your own message. So you can go directly to people who might be questioning your science or interested in your science, and you can give them the message that you want them to have. I think it's really important. Conversely, it actually puts your research in front of a bunch of people who might not have seen it before, but also journalists who would help you take your research to the public even better. So this idea that journalists can quickly come to you and ask questions in a sort of low hassle barrier environment, I think is really useful. But also other people from other disciplines can find it as well. And I often speak on Twitter to people who I'm friendly with in, say, Bayes or other of our sort of customer departments or organizations. So I think that direct contact between analysts, for example, is really important and valuable to the institution of the Hadley Center. So that's Lou Hickman. He was the editor of the Carbon Brief. He says, just to back that up, it significantly improved journalists' understanding of climate science. So his point, I think he gave a talk here. I missed it last time, but he's talked in the past about the fact that editors were surprised during the ClimateGate episode in 2009 when lots of emails were leaked. They were surprised that there was significant skepticism. They were not happy with some of the ways, in some of those ClimateGate emails, newspaper editors suddenly found reason to be more skeptical about climate change. And because there wasn't a lot of fast feedback and journalists able to contact scientists quickly, a lot of those stories ran when they might not have had there been a faster feedback. This is an interesting one, that the absence of informed voices makes neutral observers think that the deniers go unchallenged because they're right. Okay, so one of the features of climate skeptics, sort of social media and media in general, is that there's enormous amounts of it. It's vast. They just pump out huge amounts of disinformation. We'll come to some of the ways they do that later. And without a countering sort of level of information, it can be easy for independent observers to think that the disinformation is true. So to a certain extent, if you're not challenging disinformation, you're ceding territory to people who are active in giving disinformation. Okay, so just turning up and representing your position, even if you're not actively countering disinformation, just turning up is actually important. I think that's important for the Hadley Center. I think that's important for the Met Office in general. And it's important for individual scientists to kind of step up and do that. This was quite a common sort of response as well. Don't go on Twitter. It's a life shortener. And I had this from, I think Roddy's a sort of quite well-known but quite sort of mild and funny skeptic, but also from other climate scientists as well. You know, actually, there's a lot of people out there who have been onto Twitter or have been onto other forms of social media and found it unhelpful, and that's fine. I think we should recognize that it's not for everybody and that there are significant dangers, which I'll come to later. Oh, yeah. I'm seriously considering doing this, so I've ticked that box. Okay. So I thought a few sort of, again, personal. There's not much science in here, right? But personal do's and don'ts about how to engage on social media in general if you really want to talk about climate and climate science. Some of these are just sort of general communication tips, and some of them are more personal or more focused. So I think, as I just mentioned, I think saying something and turning up and saying something hopefully interesting is really important. I think, though, that choosing your message is super important, and that message might be it's important to understand climate science, or it might be, you know, here's a cool cat gif or something, I'm not sure. But knowing what you're trying to say is what I'm trying to get across here. Make it relevant. I think we spend an awful lot of time doing that for our customers through our science reports, through things like UKCP. I think we should absolutely, as individuals engaging on social media, be thinking about how to make the information we're putting out relevant to individuals and humans. This is sort of making the point that people aren't interested in aggregate rainfall. They're interested in whether their street's going to flood or not. So we should be talking about that. Keep it simple. This is my favorite graph. This is from a published paper from a few years ago. Gareth recognizes this. It's full of this stuff as well. I mean, it's a good paper, but yeah, okay. So one of my hobbies is looking at graphics in climate science, and this is one of my examples from how not to do a graphic in climate science. It's great. There's some really good information in there, but perhaps it needs a redesign. Know your audience. Okay, this is a cartoon I drew a few years ago, thinking about how anything that you say will be interpreted when you say it as a climate scientist. Here's what climate scientists say. So as the Earth is a complex system with many feedbacks, we think the risk of rapidly changing climate are considerable. By far, the simplest way to mitigate these risks is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere due to the human. Even this might not be enough to stop the worst effects of climate change, although there's always a trade-off between. And what your audience here is stop having fun, really. So don't be surprised if you're tweeting as a visible climate scientist, if your tweets are taken out of context or twisted or kind of absorbed into a culture or filtered through a culture. This is just a quick slide saying there is a science of science communication out there. Some of it's even okay and good. Some of it's really bad and tone deaf. But there's these two sort of basic models of how the public take on information from scientists, one of which is seen as the outdated and outmoded deficit model, where the public just doesn't know anything about science, and you go and fill them up with knowledge about science, and then they make the right decisions after you've filled them up with knowledge about how the atmosphere works and what happens if you put CO2 in it. But the sort of one of the competing models is the cultural cognition model, where people actively go and recruit information from their peers or from sources that they trust that is in line with their cultural values. So, you know, a fierce Republican in the US may not trust anything the Met Office says. They may trust some other people. As I mentioned earlier, Katharine Hayhoe is a right-wing and Christian professor of atmospheric science in the US, who is really active in trying to bridge the gaps between the left and the right, particularly in the US, and she's making good strides, and I think a good model for how we should do some communication. Okay, some more standard stuff. Repeat your message. Keep repeating your message. Just, repeat it. This is from Frank Luntz, who was a he was an advisor to the Republican Party during the 90s and early 2000s. There's a simple rule. You say it again, and 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 again, and again, and again, and by the time you're absolutely sick of saying it, it's about the time that your target audience has heard it for the first time. And I think if we want to get a message out, this is absolutely true. We probably have to up the amount of communication that we do. Okay? Whatever that message might be, and we decide on that. You have to keep going, you have to keep doing it, you have to fund it, and you have to get organized. This is super important to me. I think being a human, showing humanity, and this is important for our institution, I think, as well. Showing that an institution is just made up of humans is super important. And showing that science isn't just a body of knowledge, it's also a way of thinking, I think, is super important. Showing how the process of science through human processes, showing that people can make mistakes, but that we have methods for correcting those mistakes, I think is important. So don't be afraid to be a human. Do be a human on Twitter. So that's why having individual scientists out there, yes, representing the Met Office, but also representing science, for example, I think is important. Chris Hadfield, who was the commander of the International Space Station a few years ago, and also an internet superstar, he was the guy that recorded David Bowie's Space Oddity, playing the guitar while floating around the International Space Station, and got back and after a weekend and found that they'd had sort of 7 million hits on the YouTube account, and everybody went crazy for it. I read his book recently. It's really good. You should go and read it. He said, people are, yes, they're interested in science. One of his jobs is to explain why human space travel is so important and we should fund it. And he said, well, people are really interested in other people. They're interested in human stories. And I think that we should harness the power of sort of interest in human stories when we're talking about climate and climate change. And climate science, right? Not just the impacts of climate change on people, but the process of climate science. Okay, a few don'ts. Don't lie. You'd think that this was, it's not crazy advice, is it? But people do lie on social media. It has been done. It has been known. Don't do that. Don't use cliche. I'm guilty of this. A lot of climate science communication is cliche. This is a particularly good example. It's the classic polar bear, okay, the ice is receding and stuff. But the climate skeptics got a hold of this and found, and sort of had this is an odd picture, isn't it? This reflection doesn't quite make sense. And it turns out it's a photoshopped bear onto an ice floe. And there was a big fuss saying, this is, fake news in the climate science. Well, this is what climate scientists use to promote their false theories of bear death due to climate change. Okay, so that was a great backfire. But it's a cliche as well. Like, find new ways to talk about things. This picture has turned up on The Guardian, this one here. I think maybe I've seen it 20 times. It's a good picture, but there's got to be others. There's got to be other ways of communicating things. Find new ways. Don't just preach to the choir. Actually, sometimes it's good to preach to the choir. So one of the things I find brilliant on Twitter, for example, is that I'm talking to a bunch of climate scientists, and that really benefits me. A really large number of climate scientists are on Twitter, and I'm preaching to them, and we all sort of agree to a large extent on the fundamentals of climate science. But there's an awful lot of people out there who don't share our values, who I think we could be reaching, and we perhaps aren't. Certainly not through social media. One of the features of the last couple of years on social media is that those bubbles have formed and people are only teaching. People are only talking to their own groups. I think we should break that down. Okay, some more serious stuff, I guess. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll get to the end. Defense against the dark arts. So there's some, there are some techniques, some rhetorical and personal techniques that you meet online, which I'm sure have been used for years in rhetoric, but I've only just come up, sort of noticed patterns forming. particularly when you're, say, arguing with climate skeptics. They get used against you, but also other scientists. So I think it's good to know the tricks. Okay. Does everybody recognize these? Okay, so does everybody know what a troll is? Yeah? So the great thing, I wrote this talk last summer, but since last summer, or bits of this talk last summer, since last summer, a lot of these issues have now become mainstream because of various scandals with Facebook and whatever. These are becoming more sort of known in the general population. And one of the things that we've seen, actually, is that people who are seeking to influence political messaging have used climate science as a kind of testing ground for some of their tactics. So some of these tricks I'm about to explain have been used for years and years and years in climate science, and they're only just being used on the general population to influence elections, for example. So trolling was actually, it started out as people would sort of say things they didn't really believe in order to make people get angry and bite. So it was trolling as in the fishing sense, when you've got a lure and you're trying to lure somebody to say something. But now it just means, some nasty individual who's trying to be mean on the internet. That's fine. Sock puppet. Does everybody know what a sock puppet is? Has anybody heard that? You know what a sock puppet? Okay, so I could create a Twitter sock puppet. So I go online and create a different, account that's completely independent from me, and then have conversations with myself to make it look like there's something, hello, Doug. That's what they mean by sock puppet. So this happens a lot. You see people having conversations with the same people again and again and again, and it's because they've created, this spurious account, essentially. Astroturfing. People heard of astroturfing? Anybody heard of astroturfing? There's a few nods around the audience. Okay, astroturfing is great. It's creating a fake grassroots movement. So you've all seen grassroots movements where people sort of get together in their local community and go, oh, fracking is terrible, or fracking is brilliant. And these things exist. But what also exists are organizations which are funded by other people where they will create a fake movement, a whole fake movement around fracking, for example. So I saw some of that a few years ago when we were deciding whether to do fracking in the UK. And suddenly you've got people turning up with banners, and they're organized. They're organized to look real, like real groundswell movement, but actually they're fake. And you've got some offshoots from that, sort of stooges and plants, where you can create fake accounts. This is a bot farm, so or a troll farm. People heard of troll farms and bot farms these days? Yeah, no? Okay, so in Russia particularly, there are large rooms full of people that are funded probably by the state, whose job it is to argue with people online. And they also create fake accounts, and they create bots which are sometimes completely, so a bot is a sort of automatic, it's a piece of software which automatically responds to certain keywords on social media. And sometimes those are completely automatic, and they'll just tweet something like, I hate you, to a climate scientist, for example. Or they will be sort of semi-autonomous, so they might be slightly human-controlled. Okay, so these are quite common. I've run across quite a few of these. And the problem is nowadays, some of them are getting increasingly difficult to spot. So as AI and software is getting more complicated, as the money has been pouring into this kind of stuff, then the techniques that these people are using are becoming more difficult to spot. They're pretty bad to start with. Okay. How are we doing for time? If I was evil, I would tell you a few tricks about how to win at Twitter, like starting offensive. If you were to sort of have an argument with somebody on Twitter, you could start by really insulting them, and that would get them angry and put them off their flow and get them emotional so that they can't be reasonable when they come back to you. I would tell you to always have the last word in any Twitter encounter or any sort of social media encounter. Always make sure that even if you have to tweet sort of stupid pictures of cats, you get the last tweet in, because then it looks like you've won. I would tell you that actually flat-out hypocrisy is a great strategy, right? So you accuse your opponent of doing the very thing that you're doing right now in order to get some advantage over them, or you could hold them responsible. So you could say, you're responsible, Doug, for the actions of all climate scientists everywhere, and I demand that you apologize for it. So all of these things, to be clear, I'm not advocating doing any of these things, but all of these things have happened to me online. I could demand answers. Just tell me. I've asked you 1,000 times about what is the exact climate sensitivity, and you haven't told me, and I'm asking you again. Why have you never told me what the climate sensitivity is? Well, because there's some uncertainty. No, I want to know. I'm so disappointed that you haven't told me what the climate sensitivity is, Doug. I thought you were a better climate scientist than that. And if you think you're losing, you can always look at squirrel. You can change the subject, right? That happens quite a lot as well. So I've put up my blog post there. I'll put these online as well if you want to know sort of all the dark arts about how to win an argument on Twitter. Then you can see them there. But there are significant dangers, actually, I think, to engaging on social media, and we should acknowledge those. So this one was sent to me by Ed Hawkins. I'm pretty sure we should execute those pushing this global warming scam. So it's from a few years ago now. But this is relatively common, I think. And I've got to acknowledge right now, it's easier if you're me to deal with this stuff, right? So I am a white male, rapidly approaching middle-aged, career, sort of established, heterosexual scientist. And it's definitely easier for me to engage online than it is for a great many people. And I think we should acknowledge that. And I think we should find ways to even that up. So a few survival tips is Bear. To give you a few survival tips for if you are engaged on Twitter, and sometimes social media in general can get too much, and particularly with something as sort of difficult as climate or climate science. So one of the things I've noticed is that some of your tics as a scientist will be easily hacked. So we like to be right, and we like people to understand what we're trying to say. I'm trying to get this across, and I've got this evidence. And here's the evidence. This is how we do science, right? Here's the evidence. But look, see, if you only saw the evidence, then you would understand and you would agree with me. At which point, the climate skeptic comes along and says, oh, no, show me more evidence. So you go away and find more evidence. And it takes ages. And that basically continues in a loop. And what I realized is that there's a bunch of people out there who are actively trying to waste your time as a climate scientist on Twitter, because they don't want you saying things that aren't controlled by them. They don't want your message out there. They want their message out there, or they want to be seen to be countering you. Okay? So they're essentially trying to cost you time and money. This is why I don't think it's a good idea to always counter skeptics. I think we need to choose our battles really carefully. I have found that use of a lot of social media nowadays allows you to mute or block people. And I used to not block anybody. I used to not mute anybody and say, right, I'm going to burst the bubble. I'm going to talk to people outside my bubble. But I found that that was, to be honest, too depressing. Right? It was taking too much of an emotional toll. If every time you go online and talk about a certain thing, you get attacked generally by the same people. And it doesn't have to be really, really nasty. It can just be sort of constant. And it slows you down and wastes emotional energy, and it wastes your sort of energy for doing science and doing other communication. Know that social media is addictive. It's designed to be addictive. It's actually in there. That's what they do. There's teams of programmers trying to make you spend more time on Facebook and act on it, take a break. And know where to get help. So one of the really difficult things that happened last time I gave this talk last summer was that I was contacted afterwards by a female scientist who had to get off social media because she'd picked up a stalker. And she was seriously concerned enough about the stalker to remove herself from social media, but also was worried that he might contact her or get in contact with her in real life. And I know that's not. So last summer I put that up on Twitter and wrote a blog post about it. At which point, a bunch of other people came to me anonymously or came to me in my direct messages and said, yes, I've had the same experience. So this is difficult in that what that does is it removes the people who are able to talk about that experience from social media. So it creates a vacuum. So it means that there's fewer people talking about it on social media. Okay? So you're underestimating the problem because there aren't the people out there who have experienced this talking about it. So interestingly, it's got parallels with the Me Too movement, which happened after I gave this talk last time. So I think we've come quite a long way in recognizing that. But we've got a long way to go. So I think that actually we need to sort of curate, we need to tend our garden in terms of the communications environment. I think more generally we need to sort of, tend to our garden. We need to create a better communications, a less polluted, essentially, communications environment for everybody. I've got some sort of examples of things that I think that I try to do as an individual. I try to get less nasty on Twitter and less confrontational. And I've looked back at my tweets and thought, being a bit of an arse there, really. And I've tried to do that less. And I hope if we all do that, then maybe we'll... Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Quite often when people say I've been harassed on social media and they look for advice, the advice is about how to take breaks from social media or remove themselves, or it's about them, right? It's actually about the victim of harassment. And very often it's not recognizing that there's a fundamental problem in the social media environment, which I guess reflects our society in general, right? It means the onus is on the victim to do something in order to make themselves safe, where actually it's a social problem. We should all be making those people safe. And this is my sort of start at what to do about that. I think we should acknowledge that there's a problem, believe that people, when they say they've been harassed, don't harass people, and call out those that do. It does happen. I try and be net positive, and I think humor is a great sort of deflector of nastiness. And to be kind, actually, is one of the best things you can do. But also to be supportive of younger scientists, always, for example, or people who are in a less secure position. So just a couple of successes. I think sort of a moderate one, a mid-sized one, and a big success of things that I've been involved with on social media. This is my... Have you seen me talk before? I've talked about graphics and climate science and the rainbow color palette, if anybody... the rainbow color palette's got a bunch of problems, one of which is that it's not perceptually uniform, for example. So yeah, the transition between green and red, always this yellow bit stands out. So you always get these fronts in oceanography because somebody's put somebody's spotting the yellow bit and saying, hey, there's a front here, but actually it's, just, it's not any special part of the spectrum. It just looks like there is. So you do horrible things to data if you use a rainbow color palette. Don't use one. And also colorblind people can't see this, right? This is a problem. So we created a hashtag and rainbows for flags, not scientific visualizations. This is important because we want people to know that we're not against gay people. It gets tricky. But are we winning? So this picks up, order tens, a few tens of tweets a month, probably the End Rainbow hashtag, but it's full of like other geeks basically, and it's began color geeks, if you like. It's begun to get some traction. It doesn't always work. So this is this brilliant paper this week about the coral reef and how sensitive it is to climate change and how it has been impacted by climate change. And Terry Hughes, who's the professor who we got her. I didn't get in contact with Terry Hughes, who's the professor that wrote the paper, but somebody else did on behalf of NRainbow, because he put a rainbow color palette right next to a red-green one, which is like the perfect storm in terms of, miscommunication. So we sort of said, we're trying not to be negative, right? We're trying to be positive. We're trying to say, look, these bad color palettes are actually getting in the way of your message. You could communicate this better, rather than, you're bad for doing rainbow stuff, right? That's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to be net positive. So we'll chat with Terry. This was a fun one. This was the Daily Mail. This original graph is from Ed Hawkins, actually. It's now a professor at Reading, who's brilliant at sort of this kind of thing. And he's created, this is the HADCRU T4, I think, and the black line, and the red bounds, sort of the bounds of the CMIP 5 ensemble. And David Rose of the Daily Mail wrote this, this is 2016, end of 2016, newspaper article saying, look, it's just about to crash out of the CMIP 5 ensemble, and therefore all the climate models are running hot. And here's the pause, and all the climate models are wrong, and the climate sensitivity is low. So he effectively stole this from Ed without attribution. So Ed thought he'd steal it back. So we created this. Me and Richard and Ed, Tamsin Edwards, and me. When we get the 2016 HADCRU T4 records in, and we sort of just added this little bit on at the end here, and they've come right back into the middle of the CMIP 5 ensemble. So it's a spectacular success, this prediction, and the temperature is still rising. And Rich tweeted that out, and it got hundreds of retweets or thousands of retweets in the end. A lot of commentary, and a lot of people saw it. It got sort of, I think, hundreds of, sort of 16K engagements is large, right? That's the actual number of people who've responded or retweeted or favorited. That's a large number of people. And it was seen by hundreds of thousands. So one of the things I would change about this is that when we did this, Rich included David Rose, the journalist, in the tweet, right, saying, you've got this wrong. And one of the things I would say now is not to do that, because as soon as you do that, he sees every response, turns up in his notifications on Twitter. And it's tiring. It's emotionally tiring if somebody's piling into you, saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. So if I was to do this again, I would definitely not do that. You don't want to pollute his sort of environment, basically. I think that's just being mean, but we didn't do it on purpose. So there you go. But I guess the most spectacular success of climate social media, I think, is Ed's viral spiral. Has everybody seen this? Yes, lots of nods. Okay. So if you talk to Ed about it, he'll say, it was moderately successful or whatever. But what he won't tell you until you get him in the pub is that he estimates privately that it's been seen by 1.2 billion people, because it got picked up. It broke all the University of Reading servers when he was out for the weekend or something, and he put it on his blog, which is hosted on the University of Reading servers. And they started to go down because people were downloading it so much because they went viral on Twitter. At which point it gets picked up by somebody who's organizing the Rio Olympics opening ceremony, copied shamelessly without attribution again, and put onto the opening ceremony graphic. Shipped out to the world and seen by over 1 billion people at last estimate. So I think that's a pretty spectacular success, but how you put that into a sort of ref impact statement, I don't know. Good luck with that. So what next? I think bursting the bubbles. I think getting outside of our sort of little group is a really good idea. I think finding ways of engaging with people who aren't traditionally interested in climate science is a really great idea. I'm running out of time, so perhaps we'll talk about that at some other point. But I think finding the next new thing, right? I think we as an organization need to find the next new thing in how to communicate our climate science, because we're proud of it and it's important. And we're funded by the public, and the public should see us more often. And we should be more transparent about how we do things. And I think that social media is a really good way of doing that. But there's lots of other ways. And I know that people are working on those ways right now. So the Met Office Science Twitter handle has come out, and there's some people in this room that I can see who are on this list of people who are doing this. And I would strongly support getting. I mean, the Met Office has been doing Twitter for years, and it's done really well, I think. And I think we could probably replicate some of that success. And I wish you guys who are running this every success, and I'm happy to help as well. So everybody who's on Twitter, go and follow Met Office Science handle and retweet them and get involved and volunteer to take a stint, because I will be. But the novelty thing, we need to find new ways. But I think I would hope that the message would go out to the more senior people in the Met Office and in the Met Office Hadley Centre, but also our government owners, that we're going to need some forgiveness, actually, at some point. This is Grace Hopper. I love Grace Hopper. I didn't know this quote was from Grace Hopper. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission. And this is pretty much the sort of, this is the mode that I've been operating on Twitter in climate science for the last sort of 7 or 8 years, hoping that I don't mess up and hoping that I will be forgiven if I do mess up. Also self-editing quite a lot, it has to be said. Grace Hopper created the first compiler for a programming language. She was pretty awesome. And I hope that our government owners, our civil service owners, will recognize the sort of almost uniquely difficult position that being a climate scientist and being a sort of person who's active on social media puts us in terms of advocacy and making mistakes and getting things wrong and saying important things. When it comes to the civil service code and when it comes to what we are allowed, basically what we're allowed to say as private citizens and representatives of the Met Office on social media. I think there's a broader conversation. I don't think that we're quite there yet. There's a kind of, it feels like an uneasy truce sometimes in terms of being allowed to do things and then sometimes being pulled up short. And I would hope that the drive towards novelty and to better communication would allow people to give us more forgiveness for perhaps making errors. So I'll end there, and thanks for listening. And if you've got any questions, please do ask.